Welcome to Leadership and Ministry, Section 2, where we're talking about leadership approaches and leadership theories. We've already talked in the previous lecture about leadership traits and skills, those approaches to leadership, and we've seen that those are fairly limited in many ways. What we're going to talk about in this lecture is both style and situational approaches to leadership. And then the other three theories, contingency, path, goal, leader, member, will be discussed in another lecture later. The style approach to leadership begins to focus on moving people beyond just a focus on the leader themselves, and begins to help us focus on the behavior of the team as a whole, rather than just personality of the leader. And so the emphasis is on the behavior of a leader, for sure, but it also includes their actions towards those subordinates in various contexts. So two things begin to get integrated into this approach to leadership. One, the reality that leadership happens in community with people, in relationship with others. So they've got some sort of interaction towards the subordinates, but it also begins to recognize that the context, the situations around which a leader serves varies. And so these two things will be increasingly involved as we move into different approaches towards leadership and theories of leadership. So two main kinds of behaviors in the style approach to leadership. Task behaviors, which facilitate group accomplishment. So in other words, these are the things that help get things done. And the second is the relational behaviors. And these are the things that help people you work with, we'll use the term subordinates here, even though that's probably a little demeaning, but it helps subordinates feel comfortable with themselves, each other, and the situation they're in. So this style approach to leadership, to looking at leadership, looks at those two main behaviors: task, getting things done, and relational, the human to this. So we might be able to put this in a grid of something that looks like this. In the grid, you see on the bottom axis, here, right down here, you see the concern for results. There's a concern that things get done. 1 being not much concern for getting things done, and 9 being a high concern for getting things done. And then over here on the vertical axis, you see a concern for people. 1, not much concern at all for people, and 9 being a very high concern for people and their ability to get along and connect to the project or the task at hand. So as we look at this grid, I think we can find some very helpful things that will begin to connect us to the reality of this style to examining leadership. So the first one we're going to look at is this authority compliance management style. In it, we see efficiency in operations results from arranging conditions of work such that human interference is minimal. So a few words just in that definition that become really, really important. First, efficiency. It becomes really important that things get done, and get done well and in a timely manner. And then you also notice this phrase that human interference is minimal. So in authority compliance style of leadership, the big push is towards getting things done. So there's a heavy emphasis on the task and the job at hand, much less emphasis on people, hence the grading of a 9 and 1. Communicating with subordinates outside the task instructions is not emphasized at all, so there's far less emphasis on even talking to people and dealing with people. And so it's very results driven. People are regarded as tools to an end. The point is to get the project, the task done. Don't really care much about whoever you run over, however that happens, or however that may feel. So authority compliance leaders are seen as controlling, demanding, hard driving, overpowering. If you've ever worked with someone like this, then you understand exactly what this means. They don't really care at all who you are, what you are. The job is the job. So they're not surprisingly, the way they're seen is not in a very positive light typically. Is what's called country club management, and you'll see it up here. So there's a high level of concern for people, very low concern for results. In this method, thoughtful attention to the needs of people leads to a comfortable, friendly organizational atmosphere and work tempo. So it's very centered on the workers, making them comfortable. So in that, there's a very low concern for actually getting the job done. And that's coupled with a very high concern for interpersonal relationships, making sure people feel like they belong, that they're comfortable. They see leadership as friends, and that becomes very important. So it very much de-emphasizes production. So it stresses the attitudes and feelings of the people in the organization and values that above even getting things done. Country club leaders try to create a positive climate by being agreeable, eager to help, comforting, and very much non-confrontational. By avoiding controversy at all costs, oftentimes this only contributes further to the lack of production that happens. So these people, I think, as you can see, impoverished management. This is where there's a very low concern for results and a very low concern for people. In this impoverished leadership style, there's very minimal effort exerted to get work done. And that's seen as appropriate. That's okay. Basically, as long as you're sustaining organizational membership in some way, don't worry much about getting stuff done, don't worry much about people, just basically stay out of the way. High emphasis on preservation, typically, in the impoverished leadership style. So the leader is unconcerned with both the task and with interpersonal relationships. So the leader here may go through the motions, but very uninvolved and withdrawn. So we've probably seen from a distance some impoverished leadership. It typically doesn't last too long because they are just going through the motions. Very uninvolved, no passion at all about what they're doing, very withdrawn from people. So impoverished leaders have very little contact with the people they're working with, are described often as indifferent, non-committal, resigned, apathetic. They just don't care, and that comes through in some very significant ways. The next one is one that would be sort of the in-between, and that's this middle-of-the-road management. You might score them at a 5 and 5. They're sort of concerned for results and sort of concerned for people. If we're honest here, from my experience, a lot of the church and ministry organizations experience this middle-of-the-road management, to be honest. So in this, adequate organizational performance is possible through balancing the necessity of getting work done while maintaining satisfactory morale. Now, a few words I want to highlight in this definition. The first is adequate. So adequate performance is possible. So in this, there's a lot of saying, well, that's good enough. And you also see in this, this phrase at the very end of the definition, satisfactory morale. It may not be great, but it's satisfactory. It seems to be fine. Fine would be a great word to describe the middle-of-the-road management style. So these are leaders who are compromisers. They have intermediate concern for the task and for the people who do it. To achieve this sort of balance, this equilibrium, they oftentimes will avoid conflict altogether, while emphasizing moderate levels of production and interpersonal relationships. Again, good enough is okay. Can't you just get along? They don't really want to deal with things. They sort of put things all back on the workers and just encourage them just to get along and make by. Middle-of-the-road leaders are often described by their employees or workers as expedient. They prefer the middle ground. They soft pedal, especially when it comes to disagreement. And they swallow their own convictions in the interest of progress, of what they see as just at least we're moving forward in some way. But when they do that, they of course compromise some of their integrity as well. And then we have up here what we'll call team management leaders. In this, they have a very high concern for the people they're with and a very high concern for results. So for the team management style of leadership, work's accomplished through committed people, interdependence via a common stake in the organization's purpose, which leads to relationships of trust and respect. Everyone in this kind of organization has a high buy-in and is committed to the task at hand. So there's a strong emphasis both task and interpersonal relationship from the leadership. So this promotes a high degree of participation and teamwork, satisfies the basic need of the employee to be involved and committed to their work. And these team management leaders typically stimulate participation. They get people engaged. They get people determined. They make their priorities very, very clear. They follow through. They behave very open-mindedly and enjoy working. One of the things that will be noticed here is that the workers have to participate in this as well. And so it becomes important that while the leader does stimulate participation, that the workers are actively engaged in this as well. There's one other that I like to discuss, which is a style called, you might call paternalism or maternalism if you're a female. Where this sort of lands, it doesn't land specifically in one and remain in one spot on the board. If I can define it this way, reward and approval bestowed on people in return for their loyalty and obedience. Failure to comply leads to punishment. So depending on your behavior as the worker, the leader will either drive you very hard towards task and not care much about you, or the other. So either a 1-9 or a 9-1, or they will very much care for a relationship and not a task. So these are leaders who use both of those quadrants without integrating the two, and that's important. They don't integrate them. So they're either heavy on relationship with you because you're sort of in with them, because you're loyal or obedient, or they're really heavy on driving you to task and not very high on relationship because you're not loyal or obedient to them. This is often termed the benevolent dictator. This person acts gracious for the purpose of goal accomplishment, and that's pretty much what they're trying to do. They treat people in this case as though they are disassociated from the task at hand. So basically it all has to do with the relationship with the leader and very little to do with the task. And so there's a division there. The other leadership style that I want to talk about is what we might term opportunism. This is the people who, and this doesn't show up on the grid either, and you'll see why in the definition, that these are people who adapt and shift to any grid style needed to gain maximum advantage. What they're after is advancing themselves. They're looking for the opportunity to advance themselves. So they're willing to flex and adapt to any of these styles, whatever will help them, quote unquote, get ahead. So performance occurs according to a system of selfish gain. It's really important to recognize these leaders, while very adaptable, typically also very intelligent, are people who are looking out for themselves and themselves only. So what they're trying to do is whatever will make them look best, though they're willing to flex and adapt on those things. These leaders use any combination of the basic 5 styles that we just talked about for the purpose of personal advancement. So they'll be somebody's best friend if that'll help them get ahead, or they'll be a taskmaster if that will help them get ahead. They usually have one dominant grid style used in most situations, but they're willing to revert to a backup style when under pressure. So for example, they might be a taskmaster of sorts and just sort of always be banging on people but not care much interpersonally, but when a crisis comes or something happens that calls them out or might get in the way of their advancement, they're willing to flex and change on that. So maybe they'll move to the middle of the road a little bit, lessen up on the task, care a little bit more about people. But again, the goal of this person is definitely to put themselves ahead. So in this approach to leadership, you see that it all has to do with someone's style of leadership, how they integrate both task and relationship in the middle of that. So how does it work? Well, it's primarily a framework for assessing leadership in a very broad way, as behavior with a task and relationship dimension. So it basically only looks at leadership in those 2 ways. It's a fairly narrow-minded grid in that sense. Offers a means of assessing in a general way the behavior of a leader, and so it works towards that. One of the strengths of it is that it marked a major shift when this approach began in studies and in research. Is a big shift away from sort of the exclusive trait-oriented leadership approach. And this one includes behaviors and actions of the leaders and also recognizes they lead others. This is substantiated by a lot of research. There's a lot of research done on this particular style approach to leadership. At the conceptual level, a leader's style is composed of two major types of behaviors, task, and relationship. So I think it's easy for most people to understand when you say your job is either to get things done or to deal with people, which are you strongest at. I think it's easy for people to understand that. Another strength is that leaders learn a lot about themselves and how they come across to others by trying to see their behaviors in light of the task and relationship dimension. So they were use a grid like we just laid out and map out themselves or have others map them out. It can be very helpful because then they begin to understand how other people view them, and they can have an honest look at themselves. So there's opportunity there to learn and maybe grow, although there's not necessarily a specific way to help someone grow in this way. But at least they understand where they are and how other people view them. There are a lot of criticisms for this approach, of course, as well. Research has not adequately demonstrated how leader styles are associated with their performance outcomes. So in other words, there's no clear evidence which one of these particular styles that we just listed is really the best. In fact, there's no universal style of leadership that works in every situation. One of the things that research has discovered is that there's not one universal style, at least in this approach, that really works everywhere. And that becomes very significant because if you're going to teach something, which of those are you going to teach? It also implies, sort of, just by the way that it's laid out with the high scores, etc., that the most effective leadership style is high. In other words, high task, high relationship. We term that the team management style. But research doesn't really indicate that that necessarily is what is needed and what is best in every situation. Maybe there are some situations where people don't need a lot of relational buy-in from their leader and don't need that affirmation. Maybe they're already committed without that. And the same is true. Maybe they don't need a lot of emphasis on task. Maybe they have that already. So that style can emphasize that that's the one that everyone should be aiming for, but the reality may tell us otherwise. That'd be what's needed everywhere. So how do we apply it? Well, many leadership training and development programs are focused this way. They are designed along this style approach, and they're trying to help you maximize helping people get things done and caring for them. By assessing a style, managers can determine how they are perceived by others and how they could change their behaviors to become more effective. So in that sense, it provides a mirror for them to evaluate themselves and see where they are. Again, it just provides a mirror. It doesn't really challenge them in real ways to help see how improving in one area or increasing or decreasing an area will help them specifically for their team and for their situation. But it does begin to show them that where they are and how they're perceived by others. And the style approach also applies to nearly everything a leader does. That's what's nice about it. Almost everything a leader does either involves a task component or a relational component. And so in that way, the style approach to leadership definitely helps get us a picture of where we are as leaders in every step of the way. This is the style approach to leadership. And again, what we're beginning to see as we expand our approaches to leadership is more of an awareness beyond just focused on the leader, and beginning to see that what they do in relationship to others matters, and what they do in situations matter. This next approach, we'll call the situational approach, emphasizes the reality that the situation, depending on the situation, changes the kind of leadership style that is required. We'll eventually get to the contingency path goal and leader-member theories in another lecture. But to spend some time on the situational approach, the premise in the situational approach to leadership is that different situations require different kinds of leadership. I think most of us can recognize the reality of that. While we do need some consistency, we recognize in the middle of a crisis situation, for example, a kind of leadership, it may be different that's required rather than a time of peace and everything is fine and there's a lot of growth or whatever else. So in this style of situational approach to leadership, to be an effective leader requires that a person adapts his or her style to the demands of the different situations. And so to that end, leadership is composed of both a directive and supportive dimension that have to be applied appropriately given the situation. We'll talk a little bit more about that to flesh that out. But you can see this, the main work on this situational approach was around 1969 with Hersey and Blanchard's work. Leaders match their style to the competence and commitment of subordinates. So a couple things here. One, you'll see again, the leader has to adapt him or herself and their style depending on their subordinates. Competence, which in other words, their ability to get the task done, and their commitment, so their personal passion or drive to do this. So one of the things we see here is a focus on leadership in situations. So very much aware of the context. This leadership situational approach emphasizes adapting the style. And this leadership has both a directive task element and a supportive relational dimension that have to be applied appropriately to the situation. So I'm going to put this up here, and this looks confusing at first, but I'm going to try to break this down, and I think it will help us understand this particular approach to leadership if we're willing to be patient with it. So here's what I want to start with. First, I want you to see that there are 4 main leadership styles, and those are the ones indicated in sort of this wave. So one style, which is in the S4 quadrant is what we'll call it, is the directing style. Another is a coaching style. The third style listed here is a supporting style of leadership. And the last is what would be considered a delegating style of leadership. Now what you have here is an axis, and on the horizontal axis, this is directive behavior. In other words, a low directive behavior means you don't need to help people know very much about the task. They already have the skills at hand, and they're able to get the task done because they know it. On the high end of things, maybe you're asking them to do something they've never done before, and so they need a lot of training to be able to complete the task. They don't have the skill set required. That's the directive behavior. On this axis, we have the supportive, the vertical axis, we have the supportive behavior. This has to do with helping people be motivated for the task. And some tasks, perhaps, the leader needs to do very little in motivating people to get things done. It recognizes that for some things we just like better than others. I had a girl that worked for me for a while that would get incredibly excited and energized by being able to type up databases and Excel spreadsheets. So she needed very little motivation to do that. I would be the opposite end of that, to have to spend my whole day typing up a database in an Excel spreadsheet would require a lot of motivation, and I need help on that. So that's where a leader would need to help encourage on that relational end and give them passion for that. The other thing you'll notice here is high, moderate, and low. Down here, D1, 2, 3, and 4, and this has to do with the particular motivation of the worker. Let's look at it this way. The development levels have to do with the degree to which the subordinates or workers or those underneath the leader have the competence and commitment necessary to accomplish a given task or activity. So again, this is situational independence. So you see down here in what's considered D1 that they have a very low competence but perhaps a high commitment. So in other words, they're very interested in doing the job, but they have no idea how to do it. And then as we move into D2, which would be considered moderate, they have some competence and very low commitment. So they need both a lot of instruction and they need to be inspired to get the job done. Over here in what's considered D3, you have the moderate to high competence. So they either know how to do the task well or pretty well, but they don't really want to do it. And then over here in sort of the sweet spot, which needs the least amount of sort of leadership, would be this high competence and high commitment. They know how to get the task done and they're very motivated to do it. So this is the development level of the followers, and that's what we're taught as we look at down here, this bottom part. So the leadership style is directly dependent on the followers' ability and competence and their commitment to the task at hand. So let's look at each of these 4, the directing, the coaching, the supporting, and delegating. For the directing style leadership in this approach, in the situational approach, you'll see it needs high direction in terms of task, but very low support, again, because the follower is highly committed but doesn't know very much about the task at hand. So their focus for the leader is communicating the goal achievement, what needs to get done. So they spend less time using supportive behaviors, encouraging someone and getting them motivated, and more time helping train them and get them up to speed on getting the task done in a professional and adequate way. So that's the directive approach here. So as we talked about D2 earlier, the follower's passion and ability gets far less, then what is needed here is high directive and high support. This is called the coaching style of leadership. And so in it, there's the leader is focusing on communication for both goal achievement and for supporting their socio-emotional needs. So what is it you need to help get you motivated for this? So some people might need some teammates around them to help them stay motivated to get the task at hand. So maybe that means surrounding them with people like that, or maybe they need to be isolated because they get distracted by others. But you got to figure out what that is, and then also give them the training that they needed. This requires leader involvement pretty much throughout the process, and they need to be encouraging all along the way. You're doing great, and soliciting their input. How you doing? How you feeling with this? I think you're doing a good job. And so this requires a different kind of leadership from the leader. The third leadership style in this situational approach to leadership is what's called supporting. High support, low directive. So in the supporting style, the leader does not focus solely on the goals. Hey, we got to get things done. They know that the employee understands and has a high commitment or high competency in getting the task done. But they do need supportive behaviors. They need to motivate them to get things done. So they're trying to bring their skills out to accomplish the task. They know they're there, they just have to get them motivated to do them. So in this case, the leader might delegate day-to-day decision-making control, but is available to help facilitate the problem-solving issues. So a lot of times, because the employee or follower is not very committed to getting the task done, they're not very passionate about it, when a problem comes, they slow down or they stop work altogether. So this is where the leader needs to come in and help them get motivated to find a solution and help them in problem solving in those ways. But the task level of what needs to get done is the leader is capable, very capable to get things done. And so they don't need to be overseeing them and sort of micromanaging them. This is what's termed the support style. The fourth leadership style here that we're going to look at is what's called the delegating style. In this, the follower or worker needs very little support because they're very much motivated to get the task done, and they need very little training because, again, they understand how the task is done. So in this style, the leader offers far less task input and social support. They simply are facilitating their confidence and motivation in relation to the task. They're just, good job, you're doing great. How can I help you? So the leader lessens their involvement in planning, control of the details, and goal clarification. They don't need to tell them too much about what needs to get done. Once they understand what the task is, they're motivated and able to get it done. So they give over a lot of control in this model, in this delegating style of leadership. And they refrain from sticking their nose in it too much, intervening, and from trying to have a team powwow when everybody on the team is getting along well. And so the leader, a good leader, and if I can just show you this again, it's important to note that employees or followers, however you want to call them, are never in the exact same spot. For some tasks, maybe they're very motivated, but they don't know how much training. In other places, maybe they're both trained well and motivated well. Other places, maybe they need the motivational support, but they're able to get the task done. In other places, they need to learn how to do the task, but and to be motivated towards it. So all of us can probably think about jobs we've had where we've been at varying levels of this and different tasks that we've had in different organizations. It also talks about the leader's job being to ascertain exactly where subordinates are, and adapt their own leadership style to that need. So one of the really important elements here is that the leader has to be very aware of their subordinates' motivation and competence. Can they do this task? Do you know your people well enough to know if they can actually get something done? And do you know them well enough to know what they're motivated about and motivated to do? So the first task of leader is to determine the nature of the situation, and then after that to adjust his or her style to match the development level of their support. So you'll see this listed here. Quickly, the leader has to diagnose the situation. Where is the person? You might ask questions in this leadership approach. Like, what is the task that we're asking them to perform, and how complicated is it? What's the skill set of the people there, the worker, and do they have the desire to complete their job? And then after you answer those questions and feel confident about that, then you can come over and adapt your style to the prescribed style in the model. So the leadership style has got to correspond to the employee's development level. If it doesn't, then the leadership simply will not work. So if you're coaching someone or trying to coach someone, but yet they find themselves already highly motivated and highly capable, then it becomes quite a difficult fit, and oftentimes the leadership style is rejected and it winds up being a negative thing in terms of getting things done and keeping the employee motivated. And so it's important to match the appropriate leadership style to the situation. The strengths, and there are many in this particular approach to leadership. Well, first is that there's a lot of approval for it out there in the market, in the world. Situational leadership is perceived as providing a credible model for training employees to become effective leaders. It's very much seen that way. It's very practical. It's straightforward. It's easy to understand, I think, and it's applied in a variety of settings. You can apply this to all kinds of settings, from church leadership to managing the grocery store or whatever else in between. It's very prescriptive as well. Not only one of the issues with the style approach to leadership is it provides a mirror for where you are, but it doesn't really help you know what you can do differently. In this situational approach, it's very prescriptive. It tells you if this is the situation, then this is what you should be doing or not doing in various. It also involves a lot of flexibility on the part of the leader. It stresses that effective leaders are the ones who can change their style based on the task and the needs of the subordinate. So there's a lot of flexibility here, and that's very attractive. You're not locked into one leadership style. And it also recognizes different people need to be treated different ways. Everybody has different needs, and they need to be treated that way. In the same way, parents can't really treat every child the exact same. If they do, they're not going to get the same result because no kid's the same. In the same way, this is talking about leadership in that way, that leadership recognizes people are different, and each situation and task you give someone, their motivation level might vary and their ability might vary. And so the way you treat people will change over time, and the way you treat different people will be different. And so that's a strong model as well. Of course, not surprisingly, there are criticisms for this model. There's not a lot of research to back up this particular approach. There's some, but not a lot. There's a lot more research that's needed to determine how commitment and competence on the part of the follower and worker are conceptualized for each development level. In other words, how do you know how committed someone is and how competent they are? Maybe someone's very competent, but they've never told you they can do it. Well, how would you possibly know? And also, how do you really know how committed they are? And can't that vary from day to day and from situation to situation? So we need to help leaders better determine those things. And the conceptualization of commitment itself is very unclear. How do we really understand if someone's committed? Because they say they're committed? Because they work a lot of hours? That becomes a difficult thing to actually understand and quantify for a leader in terms of their value of the situation. Studies that replicate as best they can exact situations have failed to support the basic prescriptions for situational leadership model. This is a big criticism of it. In other words, they seem to lack the evidence in their repeated attempts at research to show that this model actually works across the board in terms of its prescription. And it fails to adequately address the issue of one-to-one versus group leadership in an organizational setting. In other words, how you treat one individual might be one way, but how are you going to manage a team? How are you going to lead a team of people if they have different levels of motivation among themselves and different competencies? It's impossible to lead each person individually, and especially in some settings, so it doesn't really adequately address that. And nor does it account for how particular demographics influence the leader-subordinate prescriptions of the model. In other words, if you're working with young people, does that matter? Or older people, does it matter? or if you're working with people from different cultures have different motivations. If you've traveled at all, you're probably aware of that. In different places, they value different things in different ways, and so hasn't really taken into account any of those issues either. And so that's a definite weakness of the model, at least to date. How is this applied? Well, it's often used when you bring in someone to consult, because it's easy to conceptualize this and apply it. You can begin to help people evaluate their situation, and you can begin to then prescribe based on this model what they're supposed to be able to do. It's very straightforward. When the situation changes, you need to change, so that makes it practical in terms of application. And the breadth of the situational approach facilitates its application in all kinds of organizations and levels of management. So you can apply this across almost any leadership spectrum, from managing a team to a family. You can sort of figure out if they're motivated or not, if they have the skill or not, and then adjust your leadership style appropriately according to the model. So there's a big breadth of places you can apply this particular model towards. So that concludes the second part of the approaches to leadership. In this one, we highlighted both the style approach and the situational approach to leadership. Again, as we move forward and looking at different leadership approaches and theories, as we will in the next lecture, you'll notice both that they get a little more complex in terms of the way we're able to talk about them, but not only do they get more complex, they begin to understand that more variables at play, such as the people we work with and the situations we work with. Next time when we pick up, we'll look at some leadership theories that begin to incorporate these in even more in-depth ways.